Chapter 7. Odysseus finished, and the company in the hall sat silent, like men enchanted. Then King Alcinous spoke and said, "Never, as far as we Phaeacians are concerned, wilt thou, Odysseus, be driven from thy homeward way. Tomorrow we will give thee a ship and an escort, and we will land thee in Ithaca, thine own country." The princes, captains, and counselors, marveling that they had met the renowned Odysseus, went each to his own home. When the dawn had come, each carried down to the ship on which Odysseus was to sail gifts for him. When the sun was near its setting, they all came back to the king's hall to take farewell of him. The king poured out a great bowl of wine as an offering to the gods. Then Odysseus rose up and placed in the queen's hands a two-handled cup, and he said, "Farewell to thee, O queen. Mayest thou long rejoice in thy house and thy children and in thy husband, Alcinous, the renowned king." He passed over the threshold of the king's house, and he went down to the ship. He went aboard and lay down on the deck on a sheet and a rug that had been spread for him. Straightway the mariners took to their oars and hoisted their sails, and the ship sped on like a strong sea-bird. Odysseus slept, and lightly the ship sped on, bearing that man who had suffered so much sorrow of heart, and passing through wars of men and through troublous seas. The ship sped on, and he slept and was forgetful of all he had passed through. When the dawn came, the ship was near to the island of Ithaca. The mariners drove to a harbor near which there was a great cave. They ran the ship ashore and lifted out Odysseus wrapped in the sheet and the rugs and still sleeping. They left him on the sandy shore of his own land. Then they took the gifts which the king and queen, the princes, captains, and counselors of the Phaeacians had given him, and they set them by an olive tree, a little apart from the road, so that no wandering person might come upon them before Odysseus had awakened. Then they went back to their ship and departed from Ithaca for their own land. Odysseus awakened on the beach of his own land. A mist lay over all, and he did not know what land he had come to. He thought that the Phaeacians had left him forsaken on a strange shore. As he looked around him in his bewilderment, he saw one who was like a king's son approaching. Now the one who came near him was not a young man, but the goddess Pallas Athene, who had made herself look like a young man. Odysseus arose and questioned her as to the land he had come to. The goddess answered him and said, "This is Ithaca, a land good for goats and cattle, a land of woods and wells." Even as she spoke, she changed from the semblance of a young man and was seen by Odysseus as a woman tall and fair. "Dost thou not know me, Pallas Athene, the daughter of Zeus, who has always helped thee?" the goddess said. "I would have been more often by thy side, only I did not want to go openly against my brother Poseidon, the god of the sea, whose son Polyphemus thou didst blind." As the goddess spoke, the mist that lay on the land scattered, and Odysseus saw that he was indeed in Ithaca, his own country. He knew the harbor and the cave and the hill Neriton, all covered with its forests. And knowing them, he knelt down on the ground and kissed the earth of his country. Then the goddess helped him to lay his goods within the cave, the gold and the bronze and the woven raiment that the Phaeacians had given him. She made him sit beside her under the olive tree while she told him of the things that were happening in his house. "There is trouble in thy halls, Odysseus," she said, "and it would be well for thee not to make thyself known for a time. Harden thy heart that thou mayest endure for a while longer ill treatment at the hands of men." She told him about the wooers of his life who filled his halls all day and wasted his substance, and who would slay him, lest he should punish them for their insolence, so that the doom of Agamemnon shall not befall thee. Thy slaying within thine own halls, I will change thy appearance, that no man shall know thee, the goddess said. Then she made a change in his appearance that would have been evil, but that it was to last for a while only. She made his skin wither, and she dimmed his shining eyes. She made his yellow hair gray and scanty. Then she changed his raiment to a beggar's wrap, torn and stained with smoke. Over his shoulder she cast the hide of a deer, and she put into his hands a beggar's staff. with a tattered bag and a cord to hang it by. And when she had made this change in his appearance, the goddess left Odysseus and went from Ithaca. It was then that she came to Telemachus in Sparta and counseled him to leave the house of Menelaus and Helen, and has been told how he went with Pisistratus, the son of Nestor, and came to his own ship. His ship was hailed by a man who was flying from those who would slay him, and this man Telemachus took aboard. The stranger's name was Theoclymenus, and he was a soothsayer and a second-sighted man. And Telemachus returned to Ithaca, was in peril of his life. The wooers of his mother had discovered that he had gone from Ithaca in a ship. Two of the wooers, Antonius and Eurymachus, were greatly angered at the daring act of the youth. He was gone to Sparta for help. Antonius said, "And if he finds that there are those who will help him, we will not be able to stand against his pride. He will make us suffer for what we have wasted in his house. But let us to act. I will take a ship with 20 men and lie in wait for him in a strait between Ithaca and Samos, and put an end to his search for his father." Thereupon Antonius took 20 men to a ship, and fixing masts and sails, they went over the sea. There's a little isle between Ithaca and Samos. Asteris it is called, and in the harbor of that isle he and his men lay in wait for Telemachus. 8. Near the place where Odysseus had landed, there lived an old man who was a faithful servant in his house. Umass was his name, and he was a swineherd. He had made for himself a dwelling in the wildest part of the island, and had built a wall around it, and had made for the swine pens in the courtyard 12 pens, and in each pen there were 50 swine. Old Umass lived in this place, tending the swine with 3 young men to help him. Swine pens were guarded by 4 dogs that were as fierce as the beasts of the forest. As he came near, the dogs dashed at him, yelping and snapping, and Odysseus might have suffered foul hurt if the swineherd had not run out of the courtyard and driven the fierce dogs away. Seeing before him one who looked an ancient beggar, Umass said, "Old man, it is well that my dogs did not tear thee, for they might have brought upon me the shame of thy death. I have grief and pains enough, the gods know, without such a happening. Here I sit mourning for my noble master, and fattening hogs for others to eat, while he mayhap is wandering in hunger through some friendless city. But come in, old man, I have bread and wine to give thee." The swineherd led the seeming beggar into the courtyard, and he let him sit down on a heap of brushwood and spread for him a shaggy goat skin. Odysseus was glad of his servant's welcome. He said, "May Zeus and all the other gods grant thee thy heart's dearest wish for the welcome that thou hast given me." Said Umass the swineherd, "A good man looks on all strangers and beggars as being from Zeus himself, and my heart's dearest wish is that my master Odysseus should return. Ah, if Odysseus were here, he would give me something which I could hold as mine own, a piece of ground to till and a wife to comfort me. But my master will not return, and we thralls must go in fear when young lords come to rule it over them." He went to the swine pens and brought out 2 sucking pigs. He slaughtered them and cut them small and roasted the meat. When all was cooked, he brought portions to Odysseus sprinkled with barley meal, and he brought him to wine in a deep bowl of ivy wood. When Odysseus had eaten and drunken, Umass the swineherd said to him, "Old man, no wanderer ever comes to this land, but that our lady Penelope sends for him and gives him entertainment, hoping that he will have something to tell her of her lord Odysseus. They all do as thou wouldest do if thou earnest to her. Tell her a tale of having seen or of having heard of her lord to win her ear. But as for Odysseus, no matter what wanderers or vagrants say, he will never return. Dogs or wild birds or the fishes of the deep have devoured his body ere this. Never again shall I find so good a lord, nor would I find one so kind, even if I were back in my own land and saw the faces of my father and my mother. But not so much for them do I mourn as for the loss of my master. Said Odysseus, Thou sayest that thy master will never return, but I notice that thou art slow to believe thine own words. Now I tell thee that Odysseus will return, and in this same year, and as sure as the old moon wanes and the young moon is born, he will take vengeance on those whom you have spoken of, those who eat his substance and dishonor his wife and son. I say that, and I swear it with an oath. I do not heed thine oath, said Umass the Swineherd. I do not listen to vagrants' tales about my master, since a stranger came here and cheated us with a story. He told us that he had seen Odysseus in the land of the Cretans in the house of the hero Idomeneus, mending his ships that had been broken by the storm, and that he would be here by summer or by harvest time, bringing with him much wealth. As they were speaking, the younger swineherds came back from the woods, bringing the drove of swine into the courtyard. There was a mighty din whilst the swine were being put into the pens. Supper time came on, and Umass and Odysseus and the younger swineherds sat down to a meal. Umass carved the swine flesh, giving the best portion to Odysseus, whom he treated as the guest of honor. And Odysseus said, Umass, surely thou art counseled by Zeus, seeing thou dost give the best of the meat, even to such as a one as I. And Umass, thinking Odysseus was praising him for treating a stranger kindly, said, Eat, stranger, and make merry with such fare as is here. The night came on cold with rain. Then Odysseus, to test the kindliness of the swineherd, said, Oh, that I were young and could endure this bitter night. Oh, that I were better off. Then would one of you swineherds give me a wrap to cover myself from the wind and rain. But now, verily, I am an outcast because of my sorry raiment. Then Umass sprang up and made a bed for Odysseus near the fire. Odysseus lay down, and the swineherd covered him with a mantle he kept for a covering when great storms should arise. Then, that he might better guard the swine, Umass, wrapping himself up in a cloak, and taking with him a sword and javelin to drive off wild beasts, should they come near, went to lie near the pens. When morning came, Odysseus said, I am going to the town to beg, so that I need to take nothing more from thee. Send someone with me to be a guide. I would go to the house of Odysseus and see if I can earn a little from the wooers who are there. Right well could I serve them if they would take me on. There can be no better serving man than I, when it comes to splitting faggots and kindling a fire and carving meat. Nay, nay, said Umass, do not go there, stranger. None here are at a loss by thy presence. Stay until the son of Odysseus Telemachus returns, and he will do something for thee. Go not near the wooers. It is not such a one as thee that they would have to serve them. Stay this day with us. Odysseus did not go to the town, but stayed all day with Umass. And at night, when he and Umass and the younger swineherds were seated at the fire, Odysseus said, Thou too, Umass, hast wandered far and hast had many sorrows. Tell us how thou earnest to be a slave and a swineherd. The story of Umass the Swineherd. There is, said Umass, a certain island over against Ortygia. That island has 2 cities, and my father was king over them both. There came to the city where my father dwelt a ship with merchants from the land of the Phoenicians. I was a child then, and there was in my father's house a Phoenician slave woman who nursed me. Once when she was washing clothes, one of the sailors from the Phoenician ship spoke to her and asked her, would she like to go back with them to their own land? She spoke to that sailor and told him her story. I am from Poseidon in the Phoenician land, she said. My father was named Artabas and was famous for his riches. Sea robbers caught me one day as I was crossing the fields, and they stole me away and brought me here and sold me to the master of yonder house. Then the sailor said to her, Your father and mother are still alive, I know, and they have lost none of their wealth. Wilt thou not come with us and see them again? Then the woman made the sailors swear that they would bring her safely to the city of Sidon. She told them that when their ship was raised, she would come down to it, and that she would bring what gold she could lay her hands on away from her master's house, and that she would also bring the child whom she nursed. He is a wise child, she said, and you can sell him for a slave when you come to a foreign land. When the Phoenician ship was ready to depart, they sent a message to the woman. The sailor who brought the message brought to a chain of gold with amber beads strung here and there for my mother to buy. And while my mother and her handmaids were handling the chain, The sailor nodded to the woman, and she went out, taking with her 3 cups of gold and leading me by the hand. The sun sank, and all the ways were darkened, but the Phoenician woman went down to the harbor and came to the ship and went aboard it. And when the sailor who had gone to my father's house came back, they raised the masts and sails, and took the oars in their hands, and drew the ship away from our land. We sailed away, and I was left stricken at heart. For 6 days we sailed over the sea, and on the 7th day the woman died, and her body was cast into the deep. The wind and the waves bore us to Ithaca, and there the merchants sold me to Laertes, the father of Odysseus. The wife Laertes reared me kindly, and I grew up with the youngest of her daughters, the lovely Ctimene. But Ctimene went to Same and was married to one of the princes of that island. Afterwards, Laertes' lady sent me to work in the fields, but always she treated me kindly. Now Laertes' lady is dead. She wasted away from grief when she heard no tidings of her only son, Odysseus. Laertes yet lives, but since the death of his noble wife, he never leaves his house. All day he sits by his fire, they say, and thinks upon his son's doom, and how his son's substance is being wasted, and how his son's son will have but little to inherit. So Odysseus passed part of the night, Umass telling him of his wanderings and his sorrows. And while they were speaking, Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, came to Ithaca in his good ship. Antinous had lain in wait for him, and had posted sentinels to watch for his ship. Nevertheless, Telemachus had passed by without being seen by his enemies. And having come to Ithaca, he bade one of his comrades bring the ship into the wharf of the city, while he himself went to another place. Leaving the ship, he came to the dwelling of the servant he most trusted, to the dwelling of Umass the Swineherd. 9. On the morning of his 4th day in Ithaca, as he and the swineherd were eating a meal together, Odysseus heard the sound of footsteps approaching the hut. The fierce dogs were outside, and he expected to hear them yelping against the stranger's approach. No sound came from them. Then he saw a young man come to the entrance of the courtyard, the swineherd's dogs fawning upon him. When Umass saw this young man, he let fall the vessels he was carrying, and running to him, kissed his head and his eyes, his hands. While he was kissing and weeping over him, Odysseus heard the swineherd saying, Telemachus, art thou come back to us? Like a light in the darkness thou hast appeared. I thought that never again should we see thee when I heard that thou hast taken a ship to Pylos. Come in, dear son, come in, that I may see thee once again in mine house. Odysseus raised his head and looked at his son, as a lion might look over his cub, so he looked over Telemachus. But neither the swineherd nor Telemachus was aware of Odysseus' gaze. I have come to see thee, friend Umass, and Telemachus, for before I go into the city, I would know whether my mother is still in the house of Odysseus, or whether one of the wooers has at last taken her as a wife to his own house. Thy mother is still in thy father's house, Umass answered. Then Telemachus came within the courtyard. Odysseus, in the guise of the old beggar, rose from his seat, but the young man said to him courteously, Be seated, friend. Another seat can be found for me. Umass strewed green brushwood and spread a fleece upon it. And Telemachus seated himself. Next Umass fetched a meal for him, oaten cakes and swine flesh and wine. While they were eating, the swineherd said, We have here a stranger who has wandered through many countries and has come to my house as a suppliant. Wilt thou take him for thy man, Telemachus? Said Telemachus, How can I support any man? I have not the strength of hand to defend mine own house, but for the stranger I will do what I can. I will give him a mantle and doublet, with shoes for his feet, and a sword to defend himself, and I will send him on whatever way he wants to go. But Umass, I would not have him go near my father's house. The wooers grow more insolent each day, and they might mock the stranger if he went amongst them. Then said Odysseus, speaking for the first time, Young sir, what thou hast said seems strange to me. Dost thou willingly submit to insolence in thy own father's house? But perhaps it is that the people of the city hate thee, and will not help thee against thine enemies. Ah, if I had such youth as I have spirit, or if I were the son of Odysseus, I would go amongst them this very day, and make myself the bane of each man of them. I would rather die in mine own halls than see such shame as is reported, strangers mocked at and servants injured, and wine and food wasted. Said Telemachus, The people of the city do not hate me, and they would help me if they could, but the wooers of my mother are powerful men to make the city folk afraid. And if I should oppose them, I would assuredly be slain in my father's house, for how could I hope to overcome so many? What wouldst thou have me do for thee, Telemachus, said the swineherd. I would have thee go to my mother, friend Umass, Telemachus said, and let her know that I am safe returned from Pylos. Umass at once put sandals upon his feet and took his staff in his hands. He begged Telemachus to rest himself in the hut, and then he left the courtyard and went towards the city. Telemachus lay down on the seat and closed his eyes in weariness. He saw, while thinking that he only dreamt it, a woman come to the gate of the courtyard. She was fair and tall and splendid, and the dog shrank away from her presence with a whine. She touched the beggar with a golden wand. As she did, the marks of age and beggary fell from him, and the man stood up as tall and noble looking. Who art thou? Cried Telemachus, starting up. Even a moment ago thou didst look aged and a beggar. Now thou dost look a chief of men. Art thou one of the divine ones? Odysseus looked upon him and said, My son, do not speak so to me. I am Odysseus, thy father. After much suffering and much wandering, I have come to my own country. He kissed his son with tears flowing down his cheeks, and Telemachus threw his arms around his father's neck, but scarce believing that the father he had searched for was indeed before him. But no doubt was left as Odysseus talked to him, and told him how he had come to Ithaca in a ship given him by the Phaeacians, and how he had brought with him gifts of bronze and raiment that were hidden in the cave, and told him, too, how Pallas Athene had changed his appearance into that of an old beggar. And when his own story was finished, he said, Come, my son, tell me of the wooers who waste the substance of our house. Tell me how many they number, and who they are, so that we may prepare a way of dealing with them. Even though thou art a great warrior, my father, thou and I cannot hope to deal with them. They have come not from Ithaca alone, but from all the islands around, from Dulichium and Same and Zacynthus. We too cannot deal with such a throng. Said Odysseus, I shall make a plan to deal with them. Go thou home and keep company with the wooers. Later in the day the swineherd will lead me into the city, and I shall go into the house in the likeness of an old beggar. And if thou shouldest see any of the wooers ill-treat me, harden thy heart to endure it. Even if they drag me by the feet to the door of the house, keep quiet thou, and let no one, not even thy mother Penelope, nor my father Laertes, know that Odysseus hath returned. Telemachus said, My father shalt learn soon what spirit is in me and what wisdom I have. While they talked together, the ship that Antonius had taken when he went to lie in wait for Telemachus returned. The wooers assembled and debated whether they should kill Telemachus, for now there was a danger that he would draw the people to his side and to make up a force that could drive the wooers out of Ithaca. But they did not agree to kill him then, for there was one amongst them who was against the deed. Umass brought the news to Telemachus and Odysseus of the return of Antonius' ship. He came back to the hut in the afternoon. Pallas Athene had again given Odysseus the appearance of an ancient beggar man, and the swineherd saw no change in his guest. 10. It was time for Telemachus to go into the city. He put his sandals on his feet and took his spear in his hand. And then speaking to the swineherd, he said, Friend Umass, I am now going into the city to show myself to my mother and to let her hear from my own lips the tale of my journey. And I have an order to leave with thee. Take this stranger into the city, that he may go about as he desires, asking alms from the people. Odysseus, in the guise of a beggar, said, I thank thee, Lord Telemachus. I would not stay here, for I am not of an age to wait about a hut and courtyard, obeying the orders of a master, even if that master be as good a man as thy swineherd. Go thy way, Lord Telemachus, and Umass, as thou hast bidden him, will lead me into the city. Telemachus then passed out of the courtyard and went the ways until he came into the city. When he went into the house, the first person he saw was his nurse, old Euryclea, who welcomed him with joy. To Euryclea he spoke of the guest who had come on his ship, Theoclymenus. He told her that this guest would be in the house that day, and that he was to be treated with all honor and reverence. The wooers came into the hall and crowded around him with fair words in their mouths. Then all sat down at tables, and Euryclea brought wheaten bread and wine and dainties. Just at that time, Odysseus and Umass were journeying towards the city. Odysseus, in the guise of a beggar, had a ragged bag across his shoulders, and he carried a staff that the swineherd had given him to help him over the slippery ground. They went by a rugged path, and they came to a place where a spring flowed into a basin made for its water, and where there was an altar at the nymphs, at which men made offerings. As Umass and Odysseus were resting at the spring, a servant from Odysseus' house came along. He was a goatherd, and Melanthius was his name. He was leading a flock of goats for the wooers to kill, and when he saw the swineherd with the seeming beggar, he cried out, "Now we see the vile leading the vile. Say, swineherd, whither art thou leading this wretch? It is easy to see the sort of fellow he is. He is the sort to rub shoulders against my doorposts, many doorposts, begging for scraps. Nothing else is he good for. But if thou wouldest give him to me, swineherd, I would make him watch my fields and sweep out my stalls and carry fresh water to the kids. He'd have his dish of whey from me. But a fellow like this doesn't want an honest job. He wants to lounge through the country, filling his belly without doing anything for the people who feed him up. If he goes to the house of Odysseus, I pray that he be pelted from the door." He said all this as he came up to them with his flock of goats, and as he went by, he gave a kick to Odysseus. Odysseus took thought whether he should strike the fellow with his staff or fling him upon the ground. But in the end, he hardened his heart to endure the insult and let the goatherd go on his way. But turning to the altar that was by the spring, he prayed, "Nymphs of the well, if ever Odysseus made offerings to you, fulfill for me this wish, that he, even Odysseus, may come to his own home and have power to chastise the insolence that gathers around his house." They journeyed on. When they came near, they heard the sound of the lyre within the house. The wooers were now feasting, and Phemius the minstrel was singing to them. And when Odysseus came before his own house, he caught swineherd by the hand suddenly and with a hard grip, and he said, "Lo now, I who have wandered in many lands and have walked in pain through many cities, have come at last to the house of Odysseus. There it is, standing as of old, with building beyond building, with its walls and its battlements, its courts and its doors, the house of Odysseus verily. And lo, unwelcome men keep revel within it, and the smoke of their feast rises up, and the sound of the lyre is heard playing for them." Said Umass, "What wilt thou have me do for thee, friend? Shall I bring thee into the hall and before the company of wooers, whilst I remain here, or wouldst thou have me go in before thee?" "I would have thee go in before me," Odysseus said. Now, as they went through the courtyard, a thing happened that dashed Odysseus' eyes with tears. A hound lay in the dirt of the yard, a hound that was very old. All uncared for, he lay in the dirt, old and feeble, but he had been a famous hound, and Odysseus himself had trained him before he went to the wars of Troy. Argos was his name. Now as Odysseus came near, the hound Argos knew him and stood up before him and whined and dropped his ears, but had no strength to come near him. Odysseus knew the hound and stopped and gazed at him. "A good hound lies there," said he to Umass. "Once I think he was so swift that no beast in the deep places of the wood could flee from him." Then he went on, and the hound Argos lay down in the dirt of the yard, and the same day the life passed from him. Behind Umass the swineherd, he came into his own hall in the appearance of a beggar, wretchedly clad and leaning on an old man's staff. Odysseus looked upon the young lords who wooed his wife, and then he sat down upon the threshold and went no further into the hall. Telemachus was there. Seeing Umass, he called him and gave the swineherd bread and meat, and said, "Take these and give them to the stranger at the doorway, and tell him that he may go amongst the company and crave an alms from each." Odysseus ate whilst the minstrel was finishing his song. When it was finished, he rose up and went into the hall, craving an alms from each of the wooers. Seeing him, Antinous, the most insolent of the wooers, cried out, "O notorious swineherd, why didst thou bring this fellow here? Have we not enough vagabonds? Is it nothing to thee that worthless fellows come here and devour thy master's substance?" Hear such a speech from Antinous, Telemachus had to say, Antinous, I see that thou hast good care for me and mine. I marvel that thou hast such good care. But wouldst thou have me drive a stranger from the door? The gods forbid that I should do such a thing. Nay, Antinous, give the stranger something for the sake of the house. If all the company gives him as much as I, he will have something to keep him from beggary for a 3 months' space, said Antinous, meaning by that he would work some hurt upon the beggar. Odysseus came before him. They say that thou art the noblest of all the wooers, he said. And for that reason thou shouldst give me a better thing than any of the others have given me. Look upon me. I too had a house of mine own, and was accounted wealthy amongst men, and I had servants to wait upon me. And many a time would I make welcome the wanderer, and give him something from my store. Stand far away from my table, thou wretched fellow, said Antinous. Then said Odysseus, Thou hast beauty, Lord Antinous, but thou hast not wisdom. Out of thine own house thou wouldest not give a grain of salt to a suppliant. And even whilst thou dost sit at another man's table, thou dost not find it in thy heart to give something out of the plenty that is before thee. So Odysseus spoke, and Antinous became terribly angered. He caught up a footstool, and with it he struck Odysseus in the back, at the base of the right shoulder. Such a blow would have knocked another man over, but Odysseus stood steadfast under it. He gave one look at Antinous, and then without a word he went over and sat down again upon the threshold. Telemachus had in his heart a mighty rage for the stroke that had been given his father, but he let no tear fall from his eyes, and he sat very still, brooding in his heart evil for the wooers. Odysseus, after a while, lifted his head and spoke, Wooers of the renowned queen. He said, Hear what the spirit within me bids me say to you. There is neither pain nor shame in the blow that a man may get in battle, but in the blow that Antinous has given me, a blow aimed at a beggar, there is pain and there is shame. Now I call upon that God who is the avenger of the insult to the poor, to bring not a wedding to Antinous, but the issue of death. Sit there and eat thy meat in quiet, Antinous called out, or else thou wilt be dragged through the house by thy heels, and the flesh will be stripped off thy bones. And now the lady Penelope had come into the hall, hearing that a stranger was there. She sent for Umass and bade the swineherd bring him to her, that she might question him as to what he had heard about Odysseus. Umass came and told him of Penelope's request, but Odysseus said, Umass, right willing am I to tell you the truth about Odysseus to the fair and wise Penelope. But now I may not speak to her. Go to her and tell her that when the wooers have gone, I will speak to her, and ask her to give me a seat near the fire, that I may sit and warm myself as I speak. For the clothes I wear are comfortless. As Umass gave the message to the lady Penelope, one who was there, Theoclymenus, the guest who had come in Telemachus' ship, said, O wife of the renowned Odysseus, be sure that thy lord will return to his house. As I came here on the ship of Telemachus thy son, I saw a happening that is an omen of the return of Odysseus. A bird flew out on the right, a hawk. In his talons he held a dove, and plucked her and shed the feathers down on the ship. By that omen I know that the lord of this high house will return and strike here in his anger. Penelope left the hall and went back to her own chamber. Next Umass went away to look after his swine. But still the wooers continued to feast, and still Odysseus sat in the guise of a beggar on the threshold of his own house. 11. There was in Ithaca a common beggar. He was a most greedy fellow, and he was nicknamed Iris, because he used to run errands for the servants of Odysseus' house. He came in the evening, and seeing a seeming beggar seated on the threshold, he flew into a rage and shouted at him, Get away from here, old fellow, lest you be dragged away by the hand or foot. Look you, the lords within the house are giving me the wink to turn you out, but I can't demean myself by touching the like of you. Get up now and go while I'm easy with you. Odysseus looked at the fellow and said, I have not harmed you in deed or word, and I do not grudge you anything of what you may get in this house. The threshold I sit on is wide enough for the two of us. What words this fellow has, said Iris the beggar. He talks like an old sit by the fire. I'll not waste more words on him. Get up now, heavy paunch, and strip for the fight, for I'm going to show all the lords that I can keep the door for them. Do not provoke me, said Odysseus. Old as I seem, I may be able to draw your blood. But Iris kept on shouting, I'll knock the teeth out of your jaws. I'll trounce you. Antinous, the most insolent of the wooers, saw the squabble, and he laughed to see the pair defying each other. Friends, said he, the gods are good to us and don't fail to send us amusement. The strange beggar and our own Iris are threatening each other. Let us see that they don't draw back from the fight. Let us match one against the other. All the wooers trooped to the threshold and stood round the ragged man. Antinous thought of something to make the game more merry. There are 2 great puddings in the larder, he said. Let us offer them for a prize to these pugilists. Come, Iris, come, stranger, a choice of puddings. For whichever of you wins the match, I, and more than that, whoever wins shall have leave to eat every day in this hall, and no other beggar shall be let come near the house. Go to it now, ye mighty men. All the wooers crowded round and clapped the men on to the fight. Odysseus said, Friends, an old man like me cannot fight one who is younger and abler. But they cried to him, Go on, get into the fight, or else take stripes upon your body. Then said Odysseus, Swear to me, all of you, that none of you will show favor to Iris, nor deal me a foul blow. All the wooers cried out that none would favor Iris or deal his opponent a foul blow. And Telemachus, who was there, said, The man who strikes thee, stranger, will have to take reckoning from me. Straightway Odysseus girt up his rags. When his great arms and shoulders and thighs were seen, the wooers were amazed, and Iris was frightened. He would have slipped away if Antinous had not caught him and said to him, You lubber, you, if you do not stand up before this man, I will have you flung on my ship and sent over to King Echetus, who will cut off your nose and ears and give you flesh to his dogs to eat. He took hold of Iris and dragged him into the ring. The fighters faced each other, but Odysseus with his hands upraised stood for long without striking, for he was pondering whether he would strike Iris a hard or a light blow. He seemed to him better to strike lightly, so that his strength should not be made a matter for the wooers to note and wonder at. Iris struck first. He struck Odysseus on the shoulder. Then Odysseus aimed a blow at his neck, just below the ear, and the beggar fell to the ground with the blood gushing from his mouth and nose. The wooers were not sorry for Iris. They laughed until they were ready to fall backwards. Then Odysseus seized Iris by the feet and dragged him out of the house and to the gate of the courtyard. He lifted him up and put him standing against the wall, placing the staff in the beggar's hands. He said, Sit there, and scare off the dogs and swine, and do not let such as one as you lord it over strangers. A worse thing might have befallen you. Then back he went to the hall with his beggar's bag on his shoulder, and his clothes more ragged than ever. Back he went, and when the wooers saw him, they burst into peals of laughter and shouted out, May Zeus, O stranger, give thee thy dearest wish and thy heart's desire. Thou only shalt be beggar in Ithaca. They laughed and laughed again when Antinous brought out the great pudding that was the prize. Odysseus took it from him, and another of the wooers pledged him in a golden cup, saying, May you come to your own, O beggar, and may happiness be yours in time to come. While these things were happening, the wife of Odysseus, the lady Penelope, called for Euryclea and said, This evening I will go into the hall of our house and speak to my son Telemachus. Bid my 2 handmaidens make ready to come with me, for I shrink from going amongst the wooers alone. Euryclea went to tell the handmaidens, and Penelope washed off her cheeks the traces of the tears that she had wept that day. Then she sat down to wait for the handmaidens to come to her. As she waited, she fell into a deep sleep, and as she slept, the goddess Pallas Athene bathed her face in the water of beauty, and took all weariness away from her body, and restored all her youthfulness to her. The sound of the handmaidens' voices as they came in awakened her, and Penelope rose up to go into the hall. Now when she came amongst them with her 2 handmaidens, one standing each side of her, the wooers were amazed, for they had never seen one so beautiful. The hearts of all were enchanted with love for her, and each prayed that he might have her for his wife. Penelope did not look on any of the wooers, but she went to her son Telemachus and spoke to him. Telemachus, she said, I have heard that a stranger has been ill-treated in this house. How, my child, didst thou permit such a thing to happen? Telemachus said, My lady mother, thou hast no right to be angered at that which took place in this hall. So they spoke to one another, mother and son. Now one of the wooers, Eurymachus by name, spoke to Penelope, saying, Lady, if any more than we beheld thee and the beauty thou hast now, by so many more wouldst thou have wooers tomorrow. Speak not so to me, Lord Eurymachus, said Penelope. Speak not of my beauty, which departed in the grief I felt when my lord went to the wars of Troy. Odysseus stood up and gazed upon his wife, who was standing amongst her wooers. Eurymachus noted him, and going to him said, Stranger, wouldst thou be my hireling? If thou wouldst work on my upland farm, I should give thee food and clothes, but I think thou art practiced only in shifts and dodges, and that thou wouldst prefer to go begging thy way through the country. Odysseus, standing there, said to that proud wooer, Lord Eurymachus, if there might be a trial of labor between us two, I know which of us would come out the better man. I would that we stood together, a scythe in the hands of each, and a good swath of meadow to be mown. Then would I match with thee, fasting from dawn until evening's dark. Or would that we were set plowing together, then thou shouldst see who would plow the longest and the best furrow. Or would that we two were in the ways of war, thou shouldst see who would be in the front rank of battle. Thou dost think thyself a great man, but if Odysseus should return, that door, wide as it is, would be too narrow for thy fight. So angry was Eurymachus at this speech that he would have struck Odysseus if Telemachus had not come amongst the wooers, saying, That man must not be struck again in this hall, sirs. If you have finished feasting, and if the time has come for you, go to your own homes. Go in peace, I pray you. All were astonished that Telemachus should speak so boldly. No one answered him back, for one said to the other, What he has said is proper. We have nothing to say against it. To misuse a stranger in the house of Odysseus is a shame. Now let us pour out a libation of wine to the gods, and then let each man go to his home. The wine was poured out, and the wooers departed. Then Penelope and her handmaidens went to her own chamber, and Telemachus was left with his father, Odysseus. 12. To Telemachus, Odysseus said, My son, we must now get the weapons out of the hall. Take them down from the walls. Telemachus and his father took down the helmets and shields and sharp-pointed spears. Then said Odysseus as they carried them out, Tomorrow, when the wooers miss the weapons and say, Why have they been taken? Answer them, saying, The smoke of the fire dulled them, and they no longer looked the weapons that my father left behind him when he went to the wars of Troy. Besides, I am fearful lest some day the company in the hall come to a quarrel, one with the other, and snatch the weapons in anger. Strife has come here already. And iron draws iron, men say. Telemachus carried the armor and weapons out of the hall and hid them in the women's apartment. Then, when the hall was cleared, he went to his own chamber. It was then that Penelope came back to the hall to speak to the stranger. One of her handmaidens, Melantho by name, was there, and she was speaking angrily to him. Now this Melantho was proud and hard of heart, because Antinous often conversed with her. As Penelope came near, she was saying, Stranger, art thou still here, prying things out and spying on the servants? Be thankful for the supper thou hast gotten, and betake thyself out of this. Odysseus, looking fiercely at her, said, Why shouldest thou speak to me in such a way? If I go in ragged clothes and beg through the land, it is because of my necessity. Once I had a house with servants and with much substance, and the stranger who came there was not abused. The lady Penelope called to the handmaiden and said, Thou, Melantho, didst hear it from mine own lips, and I was minded to speak to this stranger and ask him if he had tidings of my lord. Therefore it does not become thee to revile him. She spoke to the old nurse who had come with her and said, Euryclea, bring to the fire a bench with a fleece upon it, that the stranger may sit and tell me his story. Euryclea brought over the bench, and Odysseus sat down near the fire. Then said the lady Penelope, First stranger, wilt thou tell me who thou art, and what is thy name, and thy race, and thy country? Said Odysseus, "Ask me all thou wilt, lady, but inquire not concerning my name or race or country, lest thou shouldest fill my heart with more pains than I am able to endure. Verily, I am a man of grief, but hast thou no tale to tell me? We know of thee, Penelope, for thy fame goes up to heaven, and no one of mortal men can find fault with thee." Then said Penelope, "What excellence I had of face or form departed from me when my lord Odysseus went from this hall to the wars of Troy. And since he went, a host of ills has beset me. Ah, would that he were here to watch over my life. The lords of all the island around Delichium and Same and Sacineth and the lords of the land of Ithaca have come here and are wooing me against my will. They devour the substance of this house, and my son is being impoverished. Long ago, God put into my mind a device to keep marriage with any of them away from me. I set up a great web upon my loom, and I spoke to the wooers, saying, Odysseus is assuredly dead, but I crave that you be not eager to speed on this marriage with me. Wait until I finish the web I am weaving. It is a shroud for Odysseus's father, and I make it against the day when death shall come to him. There will be no woman to care for Laertes when I have left his son's house, and I would not have such a hero lie without a shroud, lest the woman of our land should blame me for neglect of my husband's father in his last days." So I spoke, and they agreed to wait until the web was woven. In the daytime I wove it, but at night I unraveled the web, so 3 years passed away. Then the 4th year came, and my wooers were hard to deal with. My treacherous handmaidens brought them upon me as I was unraveling the web, and now I cannot devise any other plan to keep the marriage away from me. My parents command me to marry one of my wooers. My son cannot long endure to see the substance of his house and field being wasted, and the wealth that should be his destroyed. He, too, would wish that I should marry, and there is no reason why I should not be wed again, for surely Odysseus, my lord, is dead. Said Odysseus, "Thy lord was known to me. On his way to Troy he came to my land, for the wind blew him out of his course, sending him wandering past Malea. For 12 days he stayed in my city, and I gave him good entertainment and saw that he lacked for nothing in cattle or wine or barley meal. When Odysseus was spoken of, the heart of Penelope melted, and tears ran down her cheeks. Odysseus had pity for his wife when he saw her weeping for the man who was even then sitting by her. Tears would have run down his own cheeks, only that he was strong enough to hold them back. Said Penelope, "Stranger, I cannot help but question thee about Odysseus. What raiment had he on when thou didst see him? And what men were with him?" Said Odysseus, "Lady, it is hard for one so long parted from him to tell thee that what thou hast asked. It is now 20 years since I saw Odysseus. He wore a purple mantle that was fastened with a brooch, and this brooch had on it the image of a hound holding a fawn between its forepaws. All the people marveled at this brooch, for it was of gold, and the fawn and the hound were done to the life. And I remember that there was a henchman with Odysseus. He was a man somewhat older than his master, round-shouldered and black-skinned and curly-headed. His name was Eurybates, and Odysseus honored him above the rest of his company. When he spoke, giving such tokens of Odysseus, Penelope wept again, and when she had wept for a long time, she said, "Stranger, thou wert made welcome, but now thou shalt be honored in this hall. Thou dost speak of the garments that Odysseus wore. It was I who gave him these garments, folding them myself and bringing them out of the chamber. And it was I who gave him the brooch that thou hast described. Ah, it was an evil fate that took him from me, bringing him to Troy, that place too evil to be named by me." Odysseus leaned towards her and said, "Do not waste thy heart with endless weeping, lady. Cease from lamentation and lay up in thy mind the word I give thee. Odysseus is near. He has lost all his companions, and he knows not how to come into this house, whether openly or by stealth. I swear it by the hearth of Odysseus to which I am come. I swear that Odysseus himself will stand up here before the old moon wanes and the new moon is born." "Ah, no," said Penelope. Often before have wanderers told me such comfortable things, and I believe them. I know now that thy word cannot be accomplished. But it's time for thee to rest thyself, stranger. My handmaidens will make a bed for thee in the vestibule, and then come to thee and bathe thy feet. Said Odysseus, thy handmaidens would be loath to touch the feet of such a wanderer such as I. But if there is in the house some old wife who has borne such troubles as I have borne, I would have my feet bathed by her. Said Penelope, here is an ancient woman who nursed and tended that hapless man Odysseus. She took him in her arms in the very hour he was born. Euryclea washed the feet of this man, who knew thy lord and mine. Thereupon the nurse, old Euryclea, fetched water both hot and cold, and brought the bath to the hearth. And standing before Odysseus in the flickering light of fire, she said, I will wash thy feet, both for Penelope's sake and for thy own. The heart within me is moved at the sight of thee. Many strangers have come into this hall, but I have never seen one that was so like as thou art to Odysseus. Said Odysseus, many people have said that Odysseus and I favor each other. His feet were in the water, and she put her hand upon one of them, and as she did so, Odysseus turned his face away to the darkness, for it suddenly came into his mind that his nurse, old Euryclea, might recognize the scar that was upon that foot. How came it there, that scar? It had been made long ago, when a boar's tusk had ripped up the flesh of his foot. Odysseus was then a youth, and he had gone to the mountain Parnassus to visit there his mother's father. One morning, with his uncles, young Odysseus went up the slope of the mountain Parnassus to hunt with hounds. In a thick lair, a mighty boar was lying. When the sound of the men trampling came near him, he sprang up with gleaming eyes and stood before them all. Odysseus, holding his spear in his hands, rushed upon him. But before he could strike him, the boar charged, ripping deep into his flesh with his tusk. Then Odysseus speared him through the shoulder, and the boar was slain. His uncles staunched the wound, and he stayed with them on the mountain Parnassus in his grandfather's house, till the wound was healed. And now as Euryclea, his old nurse, passed her hands along the leg, she let his foot drop suddenly. His knee struck against the bath, and the vessel of water was overturned. The nurse touched the chin of Odysseus, and she said, Thou art Odysseus. She looked to where Penelope was sitting, so that she might make a sign to her, but Penelope had her eyes turned away. Odysseus put his hand on Euryclea's mouth, and with the other hand he drew her to him. Woman, he whispered, say nothing, be silent, lest mine enemies learn what thou knowest now. Silent I'll be, said the nurse Euryclea. Thou knowest me, firm and unyielding I am, and by no sign will I let anyone know that thou hast come under this roof. So saying, she went out of the hall to fetch water in the place of that which had been spilt. While she came back and finished bathing his feet, then Odysseus arranged the rags around his leg to hide the scar, and he drew the bench closer to the fire. Penelope turned to him again. Wise thou art my guest, she said, and it may be that thou art just such a man as can interpret a dream that comes to me constantly. I have 21 geese in the yard outside. In my dream I see them, and then a great eagle flies down from the mountains and breaks their necks and kills them all and lays them in a heap in this hall. I weep and lament for my geese, but then the eagle comes back and perching on a beam of the roof speaks to me in the voice of a man. Take heart, O wife of Odysseus, the eagle says. This is no dream, but a true vision. For the geese that thou hast seen are thy wooers, and I, that appeared as an eagle, am thy husband, who will swiftly bring death to the wooers. Then the dream goes, and I waken and look out on the daylight and see my geese in the courtyard pecking at the wheat in the trough. Canst thou interpret this dream? Lady, said Odysseus, the dream interprets itself. All will come about as thou hast dreamed. Ah, said Penelope, but it cannot now, for the day of my woe is at hand. I am being forced by my parents to choose a husband from the wooers and depart from the house of Odysseus. And how wilt thou choose from amongst them? Said Odysseus. In this way will I make choice, said Penelope. My husband's great bow is still in the house. The one who can bend that bow and shoot an arrow through the holes in the backs of 12 axes, set one behind the other, Him will I choose for my husband. Said Odysseus, thy device is good. Penelope, and some god hath instructed thee to do this. But delay no longer the contest of the bow. Let it be tomorrow. Is that thy counsel, O stranger? Said Penelope. It is my counsel, said Odysseus. I thank thee for thy counsel, she said, and now farewell, for I must go to my rest, and do thou lie down in the vestibule and in the bed that has been made for thee. So Penelope spoke, and then she went to her chamber with her handmaids, and in her bed she thought over all the stranger had told her of Odysseus, and she wept again for him. 13. All night Odysseus lay awake, tossing this side and that, as he pondered on how he might slay the wooers and save his house from them. As soon as the dawn came, he went into the open air, and lifting up his hands, prayed to Zeus, the greatest of the gods, that he might be shown some sign as to whether he would win victory or meet with defeat. And then, as he was going within the house, he heard the voice of a woman who ground barley meal between stones. She was one of 12, but the other women had fallen asleep by the cornstones. She was an ancient, wretched woman, covered all over with dust of the grain. And as Odysseus came near her, she lifted up her hands and prayed in a weak voice, O Zeus, even for miserable me, fulfill a prayer. May this be the last day that the wooers make their feast in the house of Odysseus. They have loosened my knees with the cruel toil they have made me undergo, grinding for them the barley for the bread they eat. O Zeus, may they today sup their last. Thus the corn woman spoke as Odysseus crossed his threshold. He was glad of her speech, for it seemed to him her words were an omen from Zeus, and that vengeance would soon be wrought upon the proud and hard-hearted men who wasted the goods of the house and oppressed the servants. And now the maids came into the hall from the women's apartment, and some cleaned the tables, and others took pitchers and went to the well for water. Then men servants came in and split the faggots for the fire. Other servants came into the courtyard, Umass the Swineherd, driving fatted swine, the best of his drove, and Philetus the cattle herd bringing a calf. The goat herd, Melanthius, him whom Odysseus and Umass had met on the road the day before, also came, bringing the best goats of his flock to be killed for the wooers' feast. When the cattle herd, Philetus, saw a stranger in the guise of a beggar, he called out as he tethered the calf in the yard, Hail, stranger friend, my eyes fill with tears as I look on thee, for even now, clad as thou art in rags, thou dost make me think of my master Odysseus, who may be a wanderer such as thou in friendless lands. Ah, that he might return and make a scattering of the wooers in this hall. Umass the Swineherd came up to Philetus and made the same prayer. These two and the ancient woman at the quern were the only ones of his servants whom he heard pray for his return. And now the wooers came into the hall. Philetus, the cattle herd, and Melanthius, the evil goat herd, went amongst them, handing them bread and meat and wine. Odysseus stood outside the hall until Telemachus went to him and brought him within. Now there was amongst the wooers a man named Ctesippus, and he was the rudest and roughest of them all. When he saw Telemachus bring Odysseus within, he shouted out, He is a guest of Telemachus, to whom some gift is due from us. It will be unseemly if he should get nothing today. Therefore I will bestow this upon him as a token. Saying this, Ctesippus took up the foot of a slaughtered ox and flung it full at Odysseus. Odysseus drew back, and the ox's foot struck the wall. Then did Odysseus smile grimly upon the wooers. Said Telemachus, Verily, Ctesippus, the cast turned out happily for thyself. For if thou should have struck my guest, there would have been a funeral feast instead of a wedding banquet in thy father's house. Assuredly, I should have driven my spear through thee. All the wooers were silent when Telemachus spoke those bold words, but soon they fell laughing at something one of their number said. The guest from Telemachus' ship, Theoclymenus, was there, and he started up and went to leave the hall. Why dost thou go, my guest? Said Telemachus. I see the walls and the beams of the roof sprinkled with blood, said Theoclymenus. The second-sighted man, I hear the voice of wailing. I see cheeks wet with tears. The men before me have shrouds upon them. The courtyard is filled with ghosts. So Theoclymenus spoke, and all the wooers laughed at the second-sighted man, for he stumbled about the hall as if it were in darkness. Then said one of the wooers, Lead that man out of the house, for surely he cannot tell day from night. I will go from the place, said Theoclymenus. I see death approaching. Not one of all the company before me will be able to avoid it. So saying, the second-sighted man went out of the hall. The wooers, looking at each other, laughed again, and one of them said, Telemachus has no luck in his guess. One is a dirty beggar who thinks of nothing but what he can put from his hand into his mouth, and the other wants to stand up here and play the seer. So the wooers spake in mockery, but neither Telemachus nor Odysseus paid heed to their words, for their minds were bent upon the time when they should take vengeance upon them. 14. In the treasure chamber of the house, Odysseus' great bow was kept. That bow had been given to him by a hero named Iphitus long ago. Odysseus had not taken it with him when he went to the wars of Troy. To the treasure chamber Penelope went. She carried in her hand the great key that opened the doors, a key all of bronze with a handle of ivory. Now she thrust the key into the locks. The doors groaned as a bull groans. She went within and saw the great bow upon its peg. She took it down and laid it upon her knees and thought long upon the man who had bent it. Beside the bow was its quiver full of bronze-weighted arrows. The servant took the quiver and Penelope took the bow, and they went from the treasure chamber and into the hall where the wooers were. When she came in, she spoke to the company and said, Lords of Ithaca and of the islands around, you have come here, each desiring that I should wed him. Now the time has come for me to make my choice of a man from amongst you. Here is how I shall make choice. This is the bow of Odysseus, my lord, who is no more. Whosoever amongst you who can bend this bow and shoot an arrow from it through the holes in the back of the 12 axes which I shall have set up, him will I wed, and to his house will I go, forsaking the house of my wedlock, this house so filled with treasure and substance, this house which I shall remember in my dreams. As she spoke, Telemachus took the 12 axes and set them upright in an even line, so that one could shoot an arrow through the hole that was in the back of each axe head. Then Umass the old swineherd took the bow of Odysseus and laid it before the wooers. One of the wooers took up the bow and tried to bend it, but he could not bend it. And he laid it down at the doorway with the arrow beside it. The others took up the bow and warmed it at the fire and rubbed it with lard to make it more pliable. As they were doing this, Umass the swineherd and Philoetius the cattle herd passed out of the hall. Odysseus followed them into the courtyard. He laid a hand on each and said, Swineherd and cattle herd, I have a word to say to you, but will you keep it to yourselves, the word I say? And first, what would you do to help Odysseus if he should return? Would you stand on his side or on the side of the wooers? Answer me now from your hearts. Said Philetus, the cattle herd, may Zeus fulfill my wish and bring Odysseus back. Then thou shouldst know on whose side I would stand. And Umass said, if Odysseus should return, I would be on his side, and that with all the strength that is in me. When they said this, Odysseus declared himself. Lifting up his hand to heaven, he said, I am your master, Odysseus. After 20 years, I have come back to my own country. I find that of all my servants, by you two alone is my homecoming desired. If you needs see a token that I am indeed Odysseus, look down on my foot. See there the mark that the wild boar left on me in the days of my youth. Straightway he drew the rags from the scar, and the swineherd and the cattle herd saw it and marked it well, knowing that it was indeed Odysseus who stood before them. They cast their arms around him and kissed him on the head and shoulders. And Odysseus was moved by their tears, and he kissed their heads and their hands. As he went back to the hall, he told Umass to bring the bow to him as he was bearing it through the hall. He told him, too, to order Euryclea, the faithful nurse, to bar the doors of the women's apartment at the end of the hall, and to bid the women, even if they heard a groaning and a din, not to come into the hall. And he charged the cattle herd Philodeus to bar the gates of the courtyard. As he went into the hall, one of the wooers, Eurymachus, was striving to bend the bow. As he struggled to do so, he groaned aloud. Not because I may not marry Penelope do I groan, but because we youths of today are shown to be weaklings beside Odysseus, whose bow we can in no way bend. Then Antonius, the proudest of the wooers, made answer and said, Why should we strive to bend the bow today? Nay, lay the bow aside, Eurymachus, and let the wine-bearers pour us out a cupful each. In the morning let us make sacrifice to the archer god and pray that the bow be fitted to some of our hands. Then Odysseus came forward and said, Sirs, you do well to lay the bow aside for today, but will you not put the bow into my hands, that I may try to bend it and judge for myself whether I have any of the strength that once was mine? All the wooers were angry that a seeming beggar should attempt to bend the bow that none of their company were able to bend. Antinous spoke to him sharply and said, Thou wretched beggar, is it not enough that thou art let into this high hall to pick up scraps, but thou must listen to our speech and join in our conversation? If thou shouldst bend that bow, we will make short shrift of thee. I promise, we will put thee on a ship and send thee over to King Echetus, who will cut thee to pieces and give thy flesh to his hounds. Old Umass had taken up the bow. As he went with it to Odysseus, some of them shouted to him, Where art thou going with the bow, thou crazy fellow? Put it down. Umass was confused by their shouts, and he put down the bow. Then Telemachus spoke to him and said, Umass, beware of being the man who served many masters. Umass, hearing these words, took it up again and brought it to Odysseus, and put the bow into his hands. As Odysseus stood in the doorway of the hall, the bow in his hands, and with the arrows scattered at his feet, Umass went to Euryclea and told her to bar the door of the women's apartment at the back. Then Philodeus, the cattle herd, went out of the hall and barred the gates leading out of the courtyard. For long Odysseus stood with the bow in his hands, handling it as a minstrel handles a lyre when he stretches a cord or tightens a peg. Then he bent the great bow. He bent it without an effort, and at his touch the bowstring made a sound that was like the cry of a swallow. The wooers seeing him bend that mighty bow felt, every man of them, a sharp pain at the heart. They saw Odysseus take up an arrow and fit it to the string. He held the notch, he drew the string, and he shot the bronze-weighted arrows straight through the holes in the back of the axe head. Then as Umass took up the axes and brought them outside, he said, Thou seest, Lord Telemachus, that thy guest does not shame thee through foolish boasting. I have bent the bow of Odysseus, and have shot the arrow aright. But now it is time to provide the feast for the lords who woo thy lady mother. While it is yet light, the feast must be served to them. And with the feast they must have music and the dance. Saying this, he nodded to Telemachus, bending his terrible brows. Telemachus instantly girt his sword upon him and took his spear in his hand. Outside was heard the thunder of Zeus, and now Odysseus had stripped his rags from him and was standing upright, looking a master of men. The mighty bow was in his hands, and at his feet were scattered many bronze-weighted arrows. Chapter 15. It is ended, Odysseus said. My trial is ended. Now will I have another mark. Saying this, he put the bronze-weighted arrow against the string of the bow and shot the first of his enemies. It was Antinous. He pointed the arrow, and Antinous, who was even then lifting up a golden cup filled with wine, and was smiling with death far from his thoughts, Odysseus aimed at him and smote him with the arrow in the throat, and the point passed out clean through his neck. The wine cup fell from his hands, and Antinous fell dead across the table. Then did all the wooers raise a shout, threatening Odysseus for sending an arrow astray. It did not come into their minds that this stranger beggar had aimed to kill Antinous. But Odysseus shouted back to them, Ye dogs, ye that said in your hearts that Odysseus would never return to his home, ye that wasted my substance and troubled my wife and injured my servants, ye who showed no fear of heaven nor of the just judgments of men, behold, Odysseus returned, and know what death is being loosed on you. Then Eurymachus shouted out, Friends, this man will not hold his hands, nor cease from shooting with the bow, till all of us are slain. Now must we enter into the battle with him. Draw your swords and hold up the tables before you for shields and advance upon him. But even as he spoke, Odysseus, with a terrible cry, loosed an arrow at him and shot Eurymachus through the breast. He let the sword fall from his hand, and he too fell dead upon the floor. One of the band rushed straight at Odysseus with his sword in hand, but Telemachus was at hand, and he drove his spear through this man's shoulders. Then Telemachus ran quickly to a chamber where there were weapons and armor lying. The swineherd and the cattle herd joined him, and all three put armor upon them. Odysseus, as long as he had arrows to defend himself, kept shooting at and smiting the wooers. When all the arrows were gone, he put the helmet on his head and took up the shield that Telemachus had brought, and the two great spears. But now Melanthius, the goatherd, he who was the enemy of Odysseus, got into the chamber where the arms were kept, and brought out spears and shields and helmets, and gave them to the wooers. Seeing the goatherd go back for more arms, Telemachus and Umass dashed into the chamber, and caught him and bound him with a rope, and dragged him up near the roof beams, and left him hanging there. Then they closed and bolted the door and stood on guard. Many of the wooers lay dead upon the floor of the hall. Now one who was called Aegilas stood forward and directed the wooers to cast spears at Odysseus, but not one of the spears they cast struck him, for Odysseus was able to avoid them all. And now he directed Telemachus and Umass and Philocius to cast their spears. When they cast them with Odysseus, each one struck a man, and 4 of the wooers fell down. And again Odysseus directed his following to cast their spears, and again they cast them, and slew their men. They drove those who remained from one end of the hall to the other, and slew them all. Straightway the doors of the woman's apartment were flung open, and Euryclea appeared. She saw Odysseus amongst the bodies of the dead, all stained with blood. She would have cried out in triumph if Odysseus had not restrained her. "Rejoice within thine own heart," he said, "but do not cry aloud, for it is an unholy thing to triumph over men lying dead. These men the gods themselves have overcome because of their own hard and unjust hearts." As he spoke, the women came out of their chambers carrying torches in their hands. They fell upon Odysseus and embraced him and clasped and kissed his hands. A longing came over him to weep, for he remembered them from of old, every one of the servants who were there. 16. Euryclea, the old nurse, went to the upper chamber where Penelope lay in her bed. She bent over her and called, "Awake, Penelope, dear child, come down and see with thine own eyes what hath happened. The wooers are overthrown, and he whom thou hast ever longed to see hath come back. Odysseus thy husband hath returned. He hath slain the proud wooers who have troubled thee for so long." But Penelope only looked at the nurse, for she thought that her brain had been turned. Still Euryclea kept on saying, "In very deed Odysseus is here. He is that guest whom all the wooers dishonor in the hall." Then hearing Euryclea say these words, Penelope sprang out of bed and put her arms round the nurse's neck. "Oh, tell me if what thou dost say be true. Tell me how the stranger slew the wooers, who were so many." "I did not see the slaying," Euryclea said, "but I heard the groaning of the men as they were slain. And then I found Odysseus standing amongst many dead men, and it comforted my heart to see him standing there like a lion aroused. Come with me now, lady, that you may both enter into your heart's delight, you that have suffered so much of affliction. Thy Lord hath come alive to his own health, and he hath found his wife and his son alive and well." "Ah, no," said Penelope. "Ah, no, Odysseus hath not returned. He who has slain the wooers is one of the deathless gods, come down to punish them for their injustice and their hard-heartedness. Odysseus long ago lost the way of his returning, and he is lying dead in some far-off land." "No, no," said Euryclea. "I can show thee that it is Odysseus indeed who is in the hall. On his foot is the scar that the tusk of a boar gave him in the old days. I spied it when I was washing his feet last night, and I would have told thee of it, but he clapped a hand across my mouth to stop my speech. Lo, I stake my life that it is Odysseus, and none other who is in the hall below." Saying this, she took Penelope by the hand and led her from the upper chamber into the hall. Odysseus was standing by a tall pillar. He waited there for his wife to come and speak to him. But Penelope stood still and gazed long upon him and made no step towards him. Then said Telemachus, "Mother, can it be that thy heart is so hard? Here is my father, and thou wilt not go to him nor question him at all? Said Penelope, My mind is amazed, and I have no strength to speak, nor to ask him aught, nor even to look on him face to face. If this is indeed Odysseus, who hath come home, a place has to be prepared for him. Then Odysseus spoke to Telemachus and said, Go now to the bath, and make thyself clean of the stains of battle. I will stay and speak with the lady mother. Strange lady, said he to Penelope, is thy heart indeed so hard? No other woman in the world, I think, would stand so aloof from her husband, who after so much toil and so many trials has come back after 20 years to his own hearth. Is there no place for me here, and must I again sleep in the stranger's bed? Said Penelope, In no stranger's bed wilt thou lie, my lord. Come, Eurycleia, set up for him his own bedstead outside his bedchamber. Then Odysseus said to her, speaking in anger, How come it that my bed can be moved to this place and that? Not a bed of that kind was the bed I built for myself. Knowest thou not how I built my bed? First there grew up in the courtyard an olive tree. Round that olive tree I built a chamber, and I roofed it well, and I set doors to it. Then I sheared off all the light wood on the growing olive tree, and I rough-hewed the trunk with the adze, and I made the tree into a bedpost. Beginning with this bedpost, I wrought a bedstead, and when I finished it, I inlaid it with silver and ivory. Such was the bed I built for myself, and such a bed could not be moved to this place or that. Then did Penelope know assuredly that the man who stood before her was indeed her husband. The steadfast Odysseus, none other, knew of where the bed was placed and how it had been built. Penelope fell a-weeping, and she put her arms around his neck. O Odysseus, my lord, she said, be not angry with thy wife. Always the fear was in my heart that some guileful stranger should come here professing to be Odysseus, and that I should take him to me as my husband. How terrible such a thing would be. But now my heart is freed from all doubts, but not angry with me, Odysseus, for not throwing myself on thy neck, as the women of the house did. Then husband and wife wept together, and Penelope said, It was the gods did this to us, Odysseus, the gods who grudged that we should have joy of the days of our youth. Next they told each other of things that happened in the 20 years they were apart, Odysseus speaking of his own toils and sorrows, and Penelope telling what she had endured at the hands of the wooers. And as they told tales one to the other, slumber came upon them, and the dawn found them sleeping side by side. 17. And still many dangers had to be faced. The wooers whom Odysseus had slain were the richest and the most powerful of the lords of Ithaca and the islands. All of them had fathers and brothers who would fain avenge them upon their slayer. Now before anyone in the city knew that he had returned, Odysseus went forth to the farm that Laertes, his old father, stayed at. As he drew near, he saw an old man working in the vineyard, digging round a plant. When he came to him, he saw that this old man was not a slave nor a servant, but Laertes, his own father. When he saw him, wasted with age and all uncared for, Odysseus stood still, leaning his hand against a pear tree and sorrowing in his heart. Old Laertes kept his head down as he stood digging at the plant, and he did not see Odysseus until he stood before him and said, Old man, thou dost care for this garden well, and all things here are flourishing, fig tree and vine and olive and pear. But if a stranger may say it, thine own self is not cared for well. Who art thou that dost speak to me like this? Old Laertes said, lifting his head. I am a stranger in Ithaca, said Odysseus. I seek a man whom I once kindly treated, a man whose name was Odysseus. A stranger, he came to me, and he declared that he was of Ithaca, and that one day he would give me entertainment for the entertainment I had given him. I know not if this man be still alive. Old Laertes wept before Odysseus. Ah, said he, if thou hadst been able to find him here, the gifts you gave him would not have been bestowed in vain. True hospitality thou wouldst receive from Odysseus my son. But he has perished far from his country's soil. He has perished the hapless man, and his mother wept not over him, nor his wife, nor me, his father. So he spake, and then with his hands he took up the dust of the ground, and he strewed it over his head in his sorrow. The heart of Odysseus was moved with grief. He sprang forward and fell on his father's neck, and he kissed him, saying, Behold, I am here, even I, my father, I, Odysseus, have come back to mine own country. Cease thy lamentation until I tell thee of the things that have happened. I have slain the wooers in mine hall, and I have avenged all their injuries and all their wrongful doings. Dost thou not believe this, my father? Then look on what I will show thee. Behold, on my foot the mark of the boar's tusk. There it is from the days of my youth. Laertes looked down on the bare foot, and he saw the scar, but still his mind was clouded by doubt. But then Odysseus took him through the garden, and he told him of the fruit trees that Laertes had set for him when he, Odysseus, was a little child, following his father about the garden, 13 pear trees and 10 apple trees and 40 fig trees. When Odysseus showed him these, Laertes knew that it was his son indeed who stood before him. His son come back after 20 years. Wandering, he cast his arms around his neck, and Odysseus caught him fainting to his breast and led him into the house. Within the house were Telemachus and Umass the Swineherd and Philocius the cattle herd. They all clasped the hand of Laertes, and their words raised his spirits. Then he was bathed, and when he came from the bath, rubbed with olive oil, he looked hale and strong. Odysseus said to him, Father, surely one of the gods has made thee goodlier and greater than thou wert a while ago. Said the old hero Laertes, Ah, my son, would that I had such might as when, long before thou wert born, I took the castle of Nericus there upon the foreland. Would that in such might and with such mail upon my shoulders I stood with thee yesterday when thou didst fight with the wooers. While they were speaking in this way, the rumor of the slaying of the wooers went through the city. Then those who were related to the men slain went into the courtyard of Odysseus' house and brought forth the bodies. Those who belonged to Ithaca they buried, and those who belonged to the islands they put upon ships, and sent them with fisher folk, each to his own home. Many were wroth with Odysseus for the slaying of a friend. He who was the most wroth was Eupeithes, the father of Antinous. There was an assembly of the men of the country, and Eupeithes spake in it, and all who were there pitied him. He told how Odysseus had led away the best of the men of Ithaca, and how he had lost them in his ships. And he told them how, when he returned, he slew the noblest of the men of Ithaca and the islands in his own hall. He called upon them to slay Odysseus, saying, If we avenge not ourselves on the slayer of our kin, we will be scorned for all time as weak and cowardly men. As for me, life will be no more sweet to me. I would rather die straightway and be with the departed. Up now, and let us attack Odysseus and his followers before they take ship and escape across the sea. Many in that assembly put on their armor and went out with old Eupeithes. And as they went through the town, they met with Odysseus and his following as they were coming from the house of Laertes. Now as the two bands came close to each other, Odysseus with Telemachus and Laertes, with the swineherd and the cattle herd, with Dolius, Laertes' servant, and with the 6 sons of Dolius, and Eupeithes with his friends, a great figure came between. It was the figure of a tall, fair, and splendid woman. Odysseus knew her for the goddess Pallas Athene. Hold your hands from fierce fighting, ye men of Ithaca, the goddess called out in a terrible voice. Hold your hands. Straightway the arms fell from each man's hands. Then the goddess called them together, and she made them enter into a covenant that all bloodshed and wrong would be forgotten, and that Odysseus would be left to rule Ithaca as a king in peace. So ends the story of Odysseus, who went with King Agamemnon to the wars of Troy, who made the plan of the wooden horse by which Priam's city was taken at last, who missed the way of his return and came to the land of the lotus eaters, who came to the country of the dread Cyclops, to the island of Aeolus, and to the house of Circe, the enchantress, who heard the song of the sirens and came to the rocks, wandering into the terrible Charybdis Discilla, past whom no other man had won scatheless, who landed on the island where the cattle of the sun grazed, and who stayed upon Ogygia, the home of the nymph Calypso. So ends the story of Odysseus, who would have been made deathless and ageless by Calypso if he had not yearned always to come back to his own hearth and his own land. In spite of all his troubles and his toils, he was fortunate, for he found a constant wife and a dutiful son, and a father still alive to weep over him.